The acrid stench of burning chemicals filled the maintenance shaft as Sari stumbled forward, her iridescent violet skin slick with sweat under the flickering emergency lights. The viscous orange substance coating her left arm continued to harden, sending pulses of searing pain through her body. Each movement became more agonizing as the material constricted around her limb, pinning it tightly to her torso. "Hold still," Commander Alex Carter ordered, his broad frame nearly blocking the narrow passage as he assessed the situation. His battered combat armor, scarred from years of war, told the story of countless battles. But in this moment, his sharp blue eyes held nothing but unwavering focus. Sari's breath came in ragged gasps as another jolt of pain surged through her arm. The experimental adhesive had been designed as a security measure, but the containment breach had turned it into a death trap. She could feel the compound continuing to expand and solidify, threatening to permanently fuse her arm to her body. "You need to cut it off," she rasped, her violet eyes locking onto his. "Before it spreads." Alex didn't even acknowledge the suggestion. Instead, he dug through the pouches on his tactical belt. "Not happening. There's always another way." His voice was calm, steady, completely at odds with the dire circumstances. Sari's stomach twisted with dread as she watched him examine the hardened substance. Her silver-white hair clung to her forehead, damp with sweat and grime from their frantic escape through the tunnels. The pain was unbearable now, every slight motion sending fresh agony radiating through her trapped limb. "This compound reacts to electrical currents," Alex muttered, more to himself than to her. "If I can reverse the charge." He pulled out a multi-tool and began tweaking its settings. "Just do it quickly," Sari pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this doesn't work." "I said no." His tone was firm, final. "Humans don't give up that easily. Now stay still and trust me." Sari wanted to argue, but something about his certainty silenced her. She had worked with humans before, but Alex was different. His determination went beyond mere duty or protocol. He wasn't just trying to solve a problem. He was refusing to accept failure. The adhesive had now completely immobilized her arm, the crystalline structure creeping toward her shoulder. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as another wave of pain racked her body. "Almost there," Alex murmured, making the final adjustments. "This might feel strange." He pressed the device against the hardened material. At first, nothing happened. Then a subtle vibration coursed through her trapped limb. Slowly, the burning sensation began to ebb. Sari's eyes widened in disbelief as the rigid substance began to soften, flaking away in crumbling chunks to reveal her unharmed violet skin beneath. "The compound forms an electrochemical bond when exposed to oxygen," Alex explained, methodically working his makeshift device along her arm. "Reverse the charge and it destabilizes." Sari flexed her fingers, watching as the last remnants of the substance disintegrated. "How did you know that would work?" she asked, still stunned. Alex gave her a crooked grin. "Basic chemistry. That, and I've seen something similar before. The Vega outposts used it for fortifications during the Nyx incursion." Sari studied him as he continued dissolving the remaining adhesive. "Most would have just amputated," she murmured, "cut their losses and moved on. Then most would have failed." His voice carried a quiet intensity. "Giving up isn't in our nature, especially not when someone else's life is on the line." The last of the compound sloughed away, leaving her arm tender but intact. Sari rotated her shoulder carefully, testing the range of motion. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze. Before he could reply, a distant explosion rocked the tunnel, sending tremors through the walls. Alex was already moving, weapon drawn. "Save the thanks for later. We're not out of this yet." Chapter 2. Escape is a temporary illusion. The sound of the explosion still rang in Sari's ears, reverberating off the walls of the tunnel. She didn't need to hear it again to know what it meant. Someone was closing in. Alex's sharp eyes scanned the passageway ahead, his hand gripping the rifle at his side. His movements were precise, calm, as if they weren't on the verge of being caught by whoever, or whatever, had triggered the blast. "Stay behind me," he ordered, voice low and steady. Sari nodded, her heart racing as she moved to follow. The remnants of the adhesive left her arm sore, but she could feel it loosening with every passing minute, the healing process triggered by Alex's quick thinking. Still, she wasn't about to let her guard down. They were far from safe. The maintenance tunnel stretched ahead, a narrow, claustrophobic passage that twisted and turned in impossible angles. Their hurried escape had taken them deeper into the facility's underbelly, places where even the most seasoned soldiers dared not go. Alex led the way, his eyes flicking back to ensure she was following. The emergency lighting cast long shadows, creating a sense of disorientation. The low hum of the tunnel's machinery was a constant backdrop, but every few moments, a distant thud or the hiss of a moving object sent Sari's nerves into overdrive. "We've got about 15 minutes before they'll be on us," Alex muttered, keeping his voice steady. "Maybe less." Sari didn't need to ask who they were. The security forces sent to recover whatever had caused the breach. They were relentless. "I don't suppose you've got an escape route planned?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light, despite the growing weight of fear settling in her chest. Alex didn't reply immediately, his focus entirely on the path ahead. But she caught the subtle tightening of his jaw. "No one plans to get caught in these situations," he finally said, voice tight with a grim humor. "But I've got a few tricks left up my sleeve." Sari couldn't help but smirk, even though the situation was anything but funny. "Of course you do." They rounded another corner, and Alex abruptly halted. Sari nearly bumped into him, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the obstruction blocking their way, a heavily reinforced blast door, sealed tight and blinking with a faint red light. "Locked," Alex muttered, his fingers flying over the control panel embedded in the wall beside it. He cursed under his breath when it didn't respond. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Sari said, her voice tight with concern. "You and me both." Alex stepped back from the panel, drawing a small explosive charge from his belt. "Hold on to something." Sari barely had time to react before the sharp, deafening sound of the blast rang out, and the door exploded off its hinges, sending debris flying in every direction. "Move!" Alex shouted, pushing Sari ahead as he sprinted through the gap, rifle raised, scanning for threats. They were in an even narrower corridor now, the air thick with dust and the stench of scorched metal. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, more security forces, no doubt, responding to the explosion. "We need a way out. Now," Sari said urgently, her pulse pounding in her ears. Alex didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning every available exit as they ran. Then, to Sari's surprise, he veered toward an old maintenance hatch embedded in the floor. "There," he said, throwing it open and revealing a dark, vertical shaft beneath. Sari hesitated for a moment, fear creeping up her spine. "That doesn't look safe." "Neither does getting shot," Alex replied with a sharp grin. "You in or not?" She didn't have a choice. With no time to waste, Sari jumped down into the shaft, landing hard but managing to stay upright. Alex followed quickly, sealing the hatch above them just as the first wave of security arrived at the blast door. They descended rapidly, the shaft narrow but functional. The darkness swallowed them, leaving only the echo of their footsteps in the confined space. "This should lead us to the lower levels," Alex said after a few minutes, his voice faint but steady. "From there we can reach the extraction point." Sari barely nodded, still catching her breath. Her mind raced as she tried to keep up with Alex's rapid thinking, her thoughts bouncing from one survival strategy to another. But there was one thing she couldn't shake, the nagging feeling that they weren't just running from the security forces. The breach had been too coordinated, too efficient. Someone had orchestrated this. And whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until Sari was back in their hands. Her pulse quickened as the thought settled in her chest like a cold stone. "You've got a lot of enemies, don't you?" Sari asked quietly, her voice just loud enough for Alex to hear. Alex shot her a glance, his lips twitching with a wry smile. "You could say that." A few moments passed in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Then, just as they reached the bottom of the shaft, Alex paused and held up a hand, signaling for Sari to do the same. "Someone's coming," he whispered. Sari's heart stopped. Chapter 3, The Hunt is Never Over. The sound of boots against metal echoed faintly from above. They had only just descended into the depths of the maintenance shaft, but already the enemy was closing in. Sari felt a chill run down her spine, the weight of their pursuit heavy in the air. Alex didn't flinch, his posture rigid as he listened. He had been in this situation too many times, his instincts sharp and alert. He motioned for Sari to stay low, his hand signaling her to press herself against the damp wall of the shaft. "Wait for it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sari's pulse quickened as the sounds grew louder, closer. Her breath came shallow, and she could feel the heat of the adrenaline surging through her veins, sharpening her senses. Her fingers grazed the cool metal of the shaft walls, steadying herself as the tension between them built. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps paused above them. Sari held her breath, barely daring to move a muscle. Whoever was up there had stopped right above their hiding spot. Her eyes flicked to Alex, but he was already ahead of her, scanning every corner of the shaft with a practiced gaze. He gestured toward the far wall where a small vent grate had been loosened in the past. It was their only chance. The footsteps above them started again, much slower this time. A deliberate pace, as if the enemy was searching for any sign of movement. Alex leaned close to Sari, his breath warm against her ear. "On my mark, you make a break for the vent. I'll cover you." Sari nodded, heart hammering in her chest. She trusted him, she had no choice but to. But that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. They both crouched lower, blending into the shadows of the shaft as the footsteps drew near. One more step, Sari thought, mentally counting down. Finally, Alex gave the signal. Now. With a burst of speed, Sari bolted toward the vent grate, pushing herself against the cold metal wall as she reached for the loose edge. Her fingers slipped for a moment, the grime from the shaft making the surface slick, but she didn't stop. She yanked the grate free just in time to hear a shout from above. Alex fired, once, twice, his shots echoing sharply in the confined space of the tunnel. The sound reverberated violently, drowning out the enemy's advancing steps for just a moment. Sari threw herself through the vent, her body scraping against the sharp edges of the metal. She felt a searing pain along her side as she landed in a small, narrow room on the other side. She stumbled but managed to regain her balance. Alex followed quickly, dropping down into the room beside her. He didn't waste a moment, his rifle already aimed toward the shaft they had just come from. "Go," he commanded, his voice fierce. "Down the hall. There's an old maintenance door. It's our way out." Sari didn't need to be told twice. She turned, sprinting down the narrow hallway, her footsteps pounding against the steel floor. The room they had entered was barely more than a storage space, but it seemed to offer at least some shelter for the moment. Behind her, she could hear Alex's footsteps, always a few steps behind, but she didn't dare look back. If she did, it would only slow her down. They rounded a corner, and the faint glint of light from the maintenance door ahead offered a glimmer of hope. They were so close. Suddenly, the sharp, metallic screech of the ventilation system above them came to life, and Sari realized too late that the room was not as safe as it had seemed. A faint noise, one she had missed earlier, now made sense. The shing of a pressure plate being triggered. Before she could react, the sound of footsteps filled the hallway from both sides. Two groups closing in. Trap. Alex cursed. They were surrounded. Alex pushed Sari against the wall, crouching low as he scanned the growing shadows in both directions. The enemy had already begun to advance, their dark silhouettes closing in with alarming speed. "How many?" Sari whispered, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Too many," Alex replied tersely. He was already pulling out another explosive charge, his hands steady as he prepared to defend them both. "There's no way out." "No, there's always a way." Alex's voice was hard, the edge of determination never wavering. He tossed the charge into the center of the hallway, and within seconds, it detonated with a deafening roar. The walls shook, debris flying in all directions as the force of the blast threw Sari off balance. She hit the floor with a painful thud, but within moments, Alex was beside her, hauling her up and shoving her toward the maintenance door. "Go," he shouted. "Now." Sari barely registered the action, her mind a blur of fear and adrenaline. They weren't out of danger, not yet, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. She pushed through the door, feeling the cool rush of air against her skin as they stepped into a different, even darker corridor. Their pursuers would be right behind them, and they had only seconds before they had to make another escape. "Where's the extraction point?" Sari gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Not far," Alex said, his voice gruff but determined. "Keep moving." They ran, the sound of footsteps behind them echoing louder with each passing second. They were closing in fast. Sari could hear their breath, their footfalls, the rustle of their uniforms. She risked a glance behind them, but all she could see was darkness. Then a soft click. The unmistakable sound of a weapon being primed. They weren't just being chased anymore. They were being hunted. Chapter 4. The wolves are closing in. The corridor stretched out before them, dark and empty. Every instinct screamed for Sari to run faster, but the tightness in her chest made it harder to breathe, harder to think. They were being hunted, that much was clear now. Whoever was chasing them wasn't just trying to capture them, they wanted to end this. Sari's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, any hint of an opening. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, but none of it mattered. They were trapped in the belly of the facility with nowhere to go but forward, or back into the hands of their enemies. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, their steady rhythm mirroring the beat of her own heart. She didn't need to look back to know they were getting closer. The air in the tunnel felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them. Alex didn't slow, but Sari could see the brief flicker of concern in his eyes as they met. He was calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead, but even he couldn't outrun the inevitable forever. "We need a plan," she gasped, the weight of their predicament bearing down on her with each step. Alex's jaw clenched, his gaze flicking toward the distant end of the hallway. "We keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. "There's no time for anything else." But Sari could hear the underlying doubt in his voice. They were running on borrowed time, and he knew it as well as she did. Another explosion rattled the walls behind them, closer this time. A warning shot. They were being herded, funneled into a trap. Sari could feel the tension building, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with every step they took. "Alex," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "we can't keep running. We need to make a stand." He glanced at her, but his expression was unreadable. "And what? Fight our way through?" She didn't answer immediately. The truth was she didn't know. But the walls were closing in, and they couldn't outrun this forever. They needed to buy time, to force their enemies to play by their rules. "We make it to the maintenance hub," Sari said suddenly, an idea clicking in her mind. "There's an old control room near here. If we can get there, we can lock it down and turn the system against them. At least give us a fighting chance." Alex didn't hesitate. He knew the facility better than she did, and he could see the merit in the plan even if it was risky. "Lead the way," he said, and without another word, he followed her down the winding passage. Sari pushed forward with renewed purpose. The maintenance hub wasn't far now, but the sound of pursuit was relentless. Her mind raced, trying to anticipate their every move. She could hear the muffled voices of the enemy now, calling out commands, organizing their assault. The walls seemed to vibrate with the energy of their hunt. She could feel it, the weight of the inevitable was coming. They turned another corner, and there it was, the door to the control room. It was a heavy, reinforced entryway, looking like it hadn't been used in years. The panel beside the door was old, rusted in places, but it was still functional. Alex moved quickly, crouching beside the panel to assess it. "It's not going to be easy," he muttered, working his fingers over the controls. "But it'll hold them off for a while." Sari glanced behind them one last time. The shadows were moving, stretching along the walls as their pursuers approached. There was no more time. "We don't have much." The sudden crackle of gunfire echoed through the passage. A warning shot followed by another. The enemy had arrived. "Alex!" Sari shouted, fear tightening her chest. I know." His voice was urgent, fingers flying across the keypad. The door's control panel sparked, refusing to respond at first. Then, with a soft beep, the door began to slide open. "Go," Alex ordered, voice tight. "Get inside now." Sari wasted no time. She dove through the opening, landing hard on the cold concrete floor of the control room. Alex followed quickly, slamming the door shut just as another burst of gunfire shattered the air. They were inside, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The control room was as old and abandoned as it looked. Rusted machinery and outdated terminals covered every available surface. Sari scrambled to her feet and dashed toward the central console, her fingers flying over the buttons, looking for anything that could help. Alex stood near the door, rifle at the ready, eyes darting from the control panel to the ventilation shafts above. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of what was coming pressing down like a storm. "They're coming for us," Sari said, her voice barely above a whisper as she studied the terminal. "We need to lock this place down, now." "I'm on it," Alex replied, his voice calm but strained. Sari glanced at the door. The hum of footsteps was unmistakable, growing closer. She could hear the faint murmur of voices, the low growl of their enemies preparing for the final push. The door shuddered under a forceful impact, followed by another and then another. They were just outside. Alex's fingers moved quickly, overriding the door's systems, locking down the building's access points. The lights flickered above them as the door gave one final shudder and locked tight. "Sealed for now," he said, straightening and meeting her gaze. "But we don't have long." Sari exhaled sharply, turning back to the terminal. She had only one shot at this. If she could access the facility's defense systems, they could turn the tide. But if she failed, the door groaned again. The enemy was on the other side and time was running out. Chapter 5, The Final Stand. The sound of pounding fists against the control room door reverberated through the narrow chamber. Each impact sent a tremor through the old walls, reminding Sari that their time was rapidly running out. The enemy wasn't just going to stand outside and wait for them to come out, they were coming in one way or another. Alex stood rigid, his rifle held tightly in his hands, eyes fixed on the door as if willing it to stay shut. The hum of the ventilation system buzzed around them, a constant, almost soothing sound. But it did little to calm the rising panic gnawing at Sari's insides. They had to act. Her fingers flew over the terminal's outdated keys, the display flickering as she navigated through the facility's archaic security systems. If she could just bypass the lockdown protocols, override the security forces' systems, and gain control of the facility's internal defenses, maybe they could buy themselves enough time to escape, or better yet, take the fight to their pursuers. But the more she worked, the more the pressure built, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Each keystroke felt like a countdown, each second an eternity. She had never felt this much weight on her shoulders before. She was the one responsible for their survival now. Behind her, Alex shifted his stance, his eyes flicking toward the door as another thud echoed through the room. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but sharp. "They're preparing for a breach." Sari didn't reply, too focused on the task at hand. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, the growing pressure in her chest. She wasn't used to feeling this way, not when lives were on the line. She had faced countless impossible situations before, but this one was different. The walls were closing in, and this time it wasn't just about getting out. It was about stopping the enemy, about not letting them win. Her fingers trembled as she navigated through a series of encrypted files, each one more complex than the last. Her mind raced, and she could feel the heat of the enemy's approach, the impending clash of metal and flesh just outside the door. She couldn't afford to waste another second. "Almost there," she muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing as she worked through the system's last defenses. The flashing red warning on the screen seemed to mock her as it taunted her with its simplicity, daring her to make a mistake. She could almost hear the sound of their enemies' weapons outside, the metallic clinks of their boots. With a final, desperate push, Sari entered the final override code. Her heart skipped a beat as the system blinked, and then, success. The security doors that had once been locked down now slid open, granting her control over the facility's defense systems. The room filled with the sounds of whirring machinery, and Sari allowed herself a brief moment of relief. But she knew it was short-lived. They had only just begun to fight back. "We've got the upper hand now," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Alex nodded, his expression unreadable. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Before Sari could reply, the door buckled under the next wave of force. It groaned under the strain, and then, crack, the hinges gave way, the door swinging open with terrifying speed. The enemy flooded into the room, their guns raised. Sari's heart stuttered in her chest as the world seemed to freeze for a moment. Alex fired first, a burst of gunfire that tore into the advancing soldiers, but they were too many. The door was wide open now, and they were outnumbered, surrounded by soldiers with better equipment and more firepower. The fight was inevitable. Alex didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sari by the arm, pulling her behind him as the gunfire erupted all around them. She could hear the sharp crack of bullets hitting metal, the shouts of their pursuers echoing in the confined space. They were out of time, and their chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. Alex fired again, taking down another soldier, but there were too many. The air crackled with the sharpness of each shot, the sounds of violence filling every inch of the room. Sari's mind raced. The control room was no longer safe. They needed to move, now. "Back to the shaft," she shouted, pulling away from Alex. "We're not done yet." He glanced at her, his eyes flickering with an unspoken question. But there was no time for words. He followed her as she darted toward the ventilation shaft, her pulse thundering in her ears. They reached the opening, but it was too late. The soldiers were already closing in. Sari threw herself into the shaft first, followed quickly by Alex. As they descended into the darkness, the sounds of battle faded, but the feeling of being hunted did not. The shaft was narrow, the walls pressing in on them as they descended deeper into the facility's bowels. Sari's breath came in ragged gasps as they moved further down, the oppressive weight of their situation hanging heavy in the air. But even as the sounds of gunfire and shouting disappeared behind them, Sari knew this wasn't over. The escape was just temporary. The wolves were still on their tail, and they would keep hunting until they were either dead or cornered. They weren't free. Not yet. And as she moved deeper into the darkness, she realized that survival wasn't the end of it. The hardest part was still to come. The moment when they had to face what they had done, what they had survived, and what they still had to fight for. For now, though, they could only keep moving. They could only run. But one thing was certain, the hunt wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And sorry she would see it through to the end.